This past weekend, Paul W.S. Anderson's latest film, In the Lost Lands, was released. It was yet another in a long line of collaborations with his wife Milla Jovovich. It was based on the George R.R. Martin short story of the same name. This would be the first time I saw one of Anderson's films in the theaters, which was exciting as a fan of his work. I'm not someone who tries to portray him as a genius auteur, but instead I enjoy most of his films as pure popcorn entertainment, usually filled with eye-dropping visuals. I'm especially a fan of his earlier work such as Event Horizon, Resident Evil, and Alien vs. Predator. The shift in his filmmaking style to more strongly rely on CGI has harmed his output in my opinion. This is something that I hope he can change at some point and make a horror film in the vein of Event Horizon that leans on practical effects rather than CGI slop. In the Lost Lands would be a project that was so deeply embedded with CGI and video game style filmmaking that Anderson continued to bring this up in the lead up to the film's release. He discussed in an interview with Variety that the production created a, quote, Starfield tracking system, end quote, to allow the camera to be oriented in a digital world. This digital world was rendered on set in Unreal Engine 5, the same engine they make video games with, to allow for the lighting on the film to look better. Anderson complained about how most productions have a generic lighting system for their blue-screen filmmaking and pointed out how his system allowed for more creative usage of lighting. This was the next evolution of a career that has continually become more and more reliant on digital filmmaking tools at the expense of his former style of practical filmmaking as the primary tool, only to be enhanced through digital touch-ups. For this reason, my optimism was somewhat neutered. This would not be the return of the Anderson that I was a fan of, but I was intrigued to finally see one of his films on the big screen. The film was released on March 7th, 2025. The release for the United States was handled by Vertical. Anderson's work has for a while not done very well at the American box office, so the film's limited marketing campaign was no real surprise. It has led to a sad opening weekend that only brought in just over $1 million at the box office. We'll have to see if it can gain any kind of foothold overseas, because that weekend will ensure a quick death at the American box office. The film has predictably been ravaged by critics. As of right now, it has a 22% on Rotten Tomatoes and has been mostly receiving extremely negative reception in almost every corner of the internet that has bothered to watch the film. Of course, there are the Anderson defenders who mostly congregate on Letterboxd, who rate every one of his films 5 out of 5 stars, but this seems to have died down somewhat from the height of the vulgar auteur moment. The film stars Anderson's wife and longtime collaborator Milla Jovovich, Dave Bautista, Simon Wolf, Arlie Jover, Amara Okereke, and Fraser James, who had worked with Anderson on his directorial debut Shopping back in the early 90s. The film was written by Konstantin Werner from a story by Werner and Anderson. Jeremy Bolt continued his collaboration with Anderson as producer. Glenn McPherson was the cinematographer, with Paul Haslinger composing the music. Niven Howie would serve as editor, a shift away from the frenetic and nauseating editing of Doobie White. With that brief context unraveled, let's get into my thoughts on the film. Let's review In the Lost Lands. Unfortunately, the film was a disappointment, even considering my very modest expectations. Anderson's films have always suffered from poor writing, but this film takes the cake. The dialogue is awful, the film makes no sense, and what little plot there is in the film is entirely predictable and cliched. The characterization is non-existent. Werner's screenplay is frustratingly weak, empty, and pointless, serving only as a vehicle for Anderson to play around with his new digital tools. With some of his films, I forgive the poor writing as I am dazzled by the visual talent on display and by the pure popcorn movie fun that his movies invoke. This is not the case with The Lost Lands, as the visual landscape looks ugly across the board. The lighting that was touted by Anderson creates this weird softness in the image that makes everything feel out of focus, fuzzy, and distracting. The world itself is a perfect example of the over-the-top digital slop that is much too present in lots of films today. I don't want to continue watching because it hurts just to maintain focus on such a bland, boring, and ugly world. The film at times evokes Mad Max Fury Road, and at others the 2011 fantasy film Priest, and then at other times it feels like a rehashing of Resident Evil The Final Chapter. However, this film looks worse than all of those, and without any hint of Fury Road's intensely epic action. Instead of leaning on action to forward the plot, we get lots of slower moments. These slower moments are incredibly boring and drag on for too long. When we do get to the action, it moves too quickly, is poorly choreographed, and shot to be satisfying. We don't care about these characters as they aren't even fully drawn out, and the character building moments are either too cliched or incoherent to add any weight. The antagonists in the film are flat characters without any really interesting motivations. They serve as cliches and tropes rather than authentic feeling people. The world building feels derivative with no redeeming unique qualities of its own. It doesn't even emulate much better films properly. This is a frustrating film because if it had been made 2 decades ago, maybe it could have been interesting. In 2025, Anderson shot it in the worst way possible, exacerbating his worst tendencies and artistic traits and minimizing his strengths. The editing is at least less nauseating than Resident Evil The Final Chapter, but the film makes up for this by being hard to look at. Its dark and gritty aesthetic ends up falling flat, with the supposedly brutal moments of the narrative feeling like weak attempts at edginess. I love that Anderson chose to delve into darker themes as he did with Event Horizon, but that is no excuse for such an ugly-looking film. The CGI also stands out as horridly executed, obviously fake and immersion-breaking. This over-reliance on digital effects has been a sad trend in Anderson's career, following in lockstep with the rest of the industry and creating sloppier films as a result. CGI can be a beautiful tool, but this film showcases the worst excesses of the technology. It makes the film feel artificial, but not in a unique way like Anderson has been able to accomplish in the past, but instead in an obvious, ugly, and sad way. Hopefully he gets a wake-up call at some point to shift back to his old filmmaking style, but he only seems to continue to double and triple down on his new approach. This is a sad reality. It makes the possibility of another good film for him close to zero. It's obvious that this was adapted from a short story, and I remember a while back I tracked down the story to understand what Anderson would be adapting. Unfortunately, we get as much narrative as we did with the short story. This small amount of plot is then stretched out to a feature-length runtime, which makes the film feel very boring and predictable, which are the cardinal sins for this type of film. It feels like a poorly aged CGI fest from the early 2000s in the worst way, reminding me of Ultraviolet, another movie I found nauseatingly over-stylized. There are some small things I liked, such as there were some elements of the score that I liked. I loved the design of the train, and I thought the demons looked cool. However, this is a film that overall left me feeling empty. I have made the argument that Anderson's best films are most enjoyable when you turn off your brain and just enjoy them. However, this is a film that doesn't even work on that level. It may have had the potential to be a dark fantasy action film that was somewhat enjoyable, but that potential was squashed in a landscape of bland ugliness, cliches, and unsatisfying action. This is a film that has been met with overwhelmingly hostile reception, and there isn't much I can do to defend it. This is a bad film, one that Anderson can do better than. It will be forgotten in the world of streaming, and hopefully he can learn from this and strive to return to what made him so unique and interesting. That's all for this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. You can also check out the video on screen now. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.